Welcome to Disciple Wealth Strategies. My name is Austin Garner, and this is part 4 of our 5-part series. And the biblical financial principle we're going to discuss today is to be the banker until Christ returns. And this principle comes from Luke chapter 19, Jesus' parable of the minas, specifically verse 13. We're going to look at the entire parable in this video and really understand what Jesus meant and what are the implications of living out this principle. But before we dig into that parable, I wanted to briefly describe and explain what a mina is to begin with. It was just a standardized currency unit at that time. 1 mina equaled 100 drachmas, and a drachma was a small Greek silver coin about the size of a dime. And if you were a day laborer during that time, if you showed up to work just for the day and did just manual labor for somebody, you would work about a 12-hour shift, and at the end of that 12-hour shift, you would be paid 1 drachma, and so that was the labor wage during that time. And if you had 100 of these, you would have 1 mina. So that's basically it. It wasn't a tremendous amount of money, but for the average person, it was a decent sum. So that at least gives you an idea of what the mina is. So let's dig into the passage. So the parable of the mina is in Luke chapter 19, as I said. We're going to read verses 11, and the parable ends about verse 26 or 27. We're going to be reading from the New King James Version. Verse 11 says, "Now as they heard these things, he spoke another parable, because he was near Jerusalem and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. Therefore he said, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return." So right away we know the context that Jesus is speaking in, the context of this parable. He was on his way to Jerusalem with his disciples, and there were a group of people that had surrounded him, and they were listening to him and learning from him, and through his teaching, they acknowledged that he was, in fact, the Messiah, the promised one of God. They came to faith in him, and from their understanding of the Old Testament, they had this misconception from the Jewish tradition at that time that the Messiah, when he came, he would be a conquering king, and so they assumed that once he stepped foot in Jerusalem, that the kingdom of God would appear immediately and miraculously, all of a sudden. And so he used this parable to help them overcome their misunderstanding. When he says a nobleman went to a far country, he's talking about himself. He's the nobleman. He's going to go away for a period of time to be crowned as king, and he's referring to his death on the cross, his burial, and then his resurrection 3 days later, and then eventually his ascension to be with God the Father. And once he's with God the Father for a period of time, he's crowned as king, and then eventually he's going to return to establish his kingdom forever. So that's the context in which he's in. So he says while Jesus is away, he has work for his servants to do. That's the context. He's not conquering yet, but he will at some point in the future. While he's away, he has work for us to do. In verse 13, so he called 10 of his servants, delivered to them 10 minas, and said to them, "Do business till I come." I've always read this passage as a very generic understanding, very generic application, just to be productive, stay busy. And that is true. It can mean that on a generic level, but we gain a better understanding, a deeper, more rich understanding if we look at the original Greek word used for do business. It is the word pragmateomai, which is a Greek verb, and it has 3 applications. The first one is generic, to be occupied in anything, just to be busy, stay productive. But the second application is to carry on an actual business, make it productive, make it prosperous, provide services and goods for the community, for people, create value for others, for profit. And then the third application is more specifically to carry on the business of a banker or a trader. And I believe that the correct application of this Greek verb in this parable is this third application. I believe that Jesus is specifically telling his servants to be the banker till he comes, till he returns. That's why the principle for this, the biblical financial principle for this video is to be the banker until Christ returns. And you'll see that as we progress through this parable in the comparison that Jesus is creating. Verse 14, but his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we will not have this man reign over us. And so it was that when he returned, having received the kingdom, he then commanded these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. So here in verse 14, Jesus is pointing out the very unfortunate reality that many people in the past, throughout history, even today, refuse the lordship of Jesus, refuse his lordship. And matter of fact, they actively rebel against him. They don't want him to be Lord over their life, over the world. But we see here in this passage, and we see throughout all of Scripture, that it is a fact that Jesus is Lord, and he will return to establish his kingdom for all eternity, regardless of what we want, what we do, and what we desire. So it's just a reality. But financially, though, we see very similar language here in verse 15 as we saw in verse 13. This gain by trading, this idea that servants of Christ are to properly steward their wealth. They're investing and trading and managing resources. Interestingly, the Greek verb used here is dia pragmateomai, very similar, just with the little dia at the beginning. And just that subtle difference in the Greek verb adds a little bit different context to it, a little different meaning. It means to thoroughly, earnestly undertake a business for the sake of gain or profit. So Jesus seems to be continuing the expectation for his servants to intentionally seek profit. And as we discussed in part 3 in the prior video, there are two different forms of wealth. There is the worldly wealth, and then there's the eternal wealth. And we talked about how we should always prioritize eternal wealth. That is the most important thing. But that doesn't mean we should always neglect worldly wealth. In fact, I believe, and what we talked about last time, is that we should utilize our worldly wealth to maximize our eternal wealth. And if you still don't understand this concept, please go back and watch part 3 again if necessary to help you understand this point. Jesus continued, verse 16. Then came the first, saying, Master, your mina has earned 10 minas. And he said to him, Well done, good servant, because you were faithful in a very little, have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, Master, your mina has earned 5 minas. Likewise he said to him, You also be over 5 cities. So we see that these first two servants were obedient. They deployed the resources given to them directly into the community for profit. And they did it themselves. They didn't need a third-party member. They knew what to do. They deployed the resources themselves. We don't know what they invested in. We don't know how they lent the money. But Jesus illustrates a very substantial financial return for their direct management, for their actions. And their reward for the profit that they had gained was proportionate to their profit. We see 10 minas gained translated into 10 cities to have authority over. 5 minas, 5 cities. It's interesting to think about where these cities are. So the master gave the minas to the servants before he was established as king, in the prior kingdom. But their reward, the servant's reward, was in the new kingdom, in the master's kingdom, under the master's authority. So translating this to today, so the stewardship of resources we have today are directly proportionate or impact, or they're reflected in our wealth in eternity, heavenly treasures, if you will. So we should be good stewards today, knowing that it will translate. Matter of fact, it'll be magnified into our eternal wealth. And we talked about that in part 3 as well. Let's continue. Verse 20. Then another servant came, saying, Master, here is your mina, which I have kept put away in a handkerchief. For I feared you, because you are an austere man. You collect what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. I don't really use the word austere in my normal language these days, but other English versions of the Bible translation might say harsh or demanding. So this third servant was disobedient, and he claimed that the master was harsh as an excuse for his disobedience. He claimed that the master was so powerful that he didn't need the servant's help to gain a profit. And this seems to be a real misunderstanding on the part of the servant of where the master was actually investing his money. The master invested his money with the servant. And nowhere in this passage, nowhere in this parable, did Jesus indicate that the master cared whatsoever what the investment return was. His primary concern was, will the servants deploy the resources? Will they manage? Will they be good stewards? He just cared that they acted faithfully and obediently with what they'd been given. And this is true for us today. The Lord invests in us so that we can invest in others. This is a direct reflection of God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where God specifically promised Abraham that he would have many descendants, that through his descendants, the whole world would be blessed. And even in Abraham's life, we saw that play out. He became very wealthy, and through his wealth, he was a blessing to many people. He was very humble. He was a humble servant, and he was a blessing to many people. So we see both sides of Abraham's blessing. We see the material blessing and then the spiritual blessing from God's promise to Abraham. And we are a continuation of that. Not only do we share Christ with others, we also share physical material as well to aid in their need. So anyway, we are a continuation of Abraham's promise. So at this point in the parable, we see that the servant had flawed thinking. And now let's look at the master's response to that flawed thinking. Verse 22, and the master said to the servant, out of your own mouth I will judge you, you wicked servant. You knew that I was an austere man, collecting what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, that at my coming I might have collected it with interest? So the master clearly points out where he invested his money. He clearly points out, I gave it to you. I was investing in you, and you knew it. And it's very difficult for me to believe the servant's claim that the master was harsh when the master gave alternative options to account for any laziness that the servant might have. He basically told him, the least you could have done is given it to the bankers to invest on your behalf. But let's take that idea a little further. Suppose that the servant did give the money to the bankers to invest on his behalf. What would the bankers do with it? Wouldn't they invest it into the community, lend it into the community for interest, for profit? Isn't that exactly what the first two servants did? So if the banker is going to do exactly what the first two servants did, but he's going to share a portion of the profit with the servant, this hypothetical servant, as interest, he's going to give him a little piece of the interest. How much interest is he going to give? We don't know based on the parable. We don't know what the interest rates were at that time. But we can just guess. We can just make something up. Suppose it was astronomical, like 50%. Suppose he deposited his money with the bankers, and the servant was earning 50% on his deposit. It's a crazy number, but let's play along with this. What is the profit potential of the banker? Wasn't it the same as the first or second servant? Wouldn't the banker have the same potential, 1,000% interest? Or 1,000% return, not necessarily interest, but so suppose that the banker deployed the money into the community and gained 1,000% return. Well, he only gave 50% to this hypothetical servant. Well, who got the difference? Who kept the 950%? The banker. The servant forfeited his responsibility and his incredible opportunity to the banker. He abdicated his responsibility, and the banker profited handsomely for having that power. The same is true today. It's amazing to me how many people believe that the absolute best thing that they can do is give their money to bankers, give them to the fund managers and financial advisors and brokers and people like that, so-called financial experts. That is not true. That is, Jesus seems to be saying it is way more profitable if you will maintain that yourself, will you take control of that function yourself. And bankers live very well off of our financial behavior. And Jesus seems to be pointing out that it should be us. Jesus seems to be telling us that you can give your money to the bankers, to these fund managers, to all these experts, so-called experts, to manage the blessings I gave you if you want to. But I would much rather you be the banker yourself. Do what the bankers do yourself. This is a major paradigm shift in the way we think today, financially. But let it marinate for just a minute. Think about how your life would be different if you were in control of the banking function in your life. If the profit that bankers and other financial institutions were making on your behavior, what if that wasn't true? What if you were capturing that profit yourself? And that's the point. Jesus continues, verse 24. And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to him who has 10 minas. But they said to him, Master, he already has 10 minas. For I say to you that to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. A lot of times when I read this passage, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the third servant who was unfaithful, who was disobedient. And to me, it seems harsh on the third, if I'm from the perspective of the third servant. But what about from the perspective of the first two servants, the faithful servants? The famous historical pastor Matthew Henry has some great commentary on this section of passage. He says, it is Old English, so I'll do my best to make it easy to understand, but then I'll kind of translate a little bit with common vernacular. Matthew Henry said, those should be most encouraged who have been most industrious, and that those who have laid out themselves most to do good should have their opportunities of doing good enlarged and be put into a higher and more extensive sphere of usefulness. To him that hath gotten shall more be given, that he may be in a capacity to get more. So it's this idea that good stewards multiply what they have. They do good with what they have. And those faithful stewards should receive more to manage. Their capacity should expand so that they can do more good. That's the principle that Jesus is pointing out. R. Nelson Nash said it this way. He said, if you have a readily accessible, ever-increasing pool of capital, opportunities will track you down. So there's this misconception, this phrase that's floating around in the financial world. It's this phrase that says, opportunities attract capital. We hear that a lot from like fund managers and financial advisors and people like that. And it is flawed thinking because it assumes that the capital has already been generated, it's already been created, it's already available. And if you just think about it for a second, the truth is that capital attracts opportunities. And the people who spout this misconception, the opportunities attract capital, all they're really saying is They want to create opportunities to attract your capital, separate you from your capital. Not necessarily in a bad way. Not all the time they're doing it mischievously, but typically it profits them more than it does you. But regardless, capital attracts opportunity. So based on this parable, each of the servants had three options. They could do nothing. They could give what they had to the bankers to manage on their behalf, or they could be the banker, do what the bankers do. And based on what we just discussed, excuse me, it seems Jesus would prefer us to choose option 3. But he gives us room for option 2 also. So we can give our money to the bankers we want, but we should also have the ability to control and manage those resources ourselves like a banker, be our own banker. This is the exact characteristics of dividend-paying whole life insurance from a mutual company. In R. Nelson Nash's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, he explained the process of banking through life insurance with a diagram. And through this diagram, he kind of showed that banking is a process. It's not a product. It's not about life insurance. It's not about a bank account. It's not about any product. It's about the process of banking, the flow of money through your life. And that life insurance, structured with high cash value from a mutual company, has all the right ingredients, the right features that allow you and I to control that process in our life. So as a policyholder, I pay a premium. And it goes into a large pool of money with the insurance company, their investment portfolio. And they must put that money to work. They must deploy that money in various different investments. And most of them, I mean, they're typically very conservative. High-quality real estate, high-quality mortgages, bonds, government and corporate bonds. But the absolute best investment they can make is by lending money to policy owners through the loan provision. And the profit that they make from their investments is how they pay the death benefits in the future, how they pay for the ongoing operation expenses and the dividends to the owners. Me, I'm an owner. So by paying a premium and then letting the insurance company deploy those resources to various different investments, I'm allowing them to be my banker, to deploy my resources for the benefit of my policy, my contract. But with the cash value building in the policy, I have 100% access to that cash value. And I could take withdrawals, which reduce the cash value and therefore limit and hinder the current and future performance of the contract, or I can access the cash value through policy loans. Whereas if I take a policy loan, it's just collateralizing the cash value. The cash value stays put and continues compounding uninterrupted. That is, if it's a non-direct recognition company. More on that later. So if I take a policy loan, the cash value continues growing. Now, I will be paying interest on that loan. Why would I want to pay interest on a policy loan for my own account? Well, I'm an owner of the company, and I want the company that I'm an owner of to be profitable so that they can continue providing an excellent product and an excellent service to me and other people. And in so doing, I'm directly contributing to the profitability of the company that I own, which indirectly supports the growth of my policy. And so if I take out a policy loan, I should pay it back with interest. I should be willing to if I want it to get better and better. But suppose I don't. The outstanding loan will be paid for, guaranteed. As soon as I take it, it's already guaranteed to be paid for by the death benefit. If I do not pay it back in my lifetime, when I pass away, my beneficiaries will pay for it out of the death benefit. The death benefit will be reduced by the outstanding loan and the interest owed. So, of all the investments the insurance company can make, all of them have some risk associated with them, except to a policy owner. It is a guaranteed investment return. That's what I said. That's what I meant by the policy owner is the absolute best investment that a life insurance company can make. And suppose for a moment that as a policy owner, I take out a policy loan, which continues the compounding effect and the growth of my policy, and then I take that money and go invest in a profitable investment, a business deal. Well, not only am I controlling the financing side, but I'm also controlling the investment side, which increases my profit tremendously. The profit that I make on the investment can go back into the policy as for the premiums or to pay back loans so I can recollateralize them, whatever. But by controlling both sides, I'm dramatically increasing my profitability. So theoretically, I could actually experience the financial results of the first two servants, the faithful servants, in this parable. I know that it might be hard to believe, but my profitability potential dramatically increases. Mutually owned whole life insurance gives me the ability to allow the insurance company to be the banker or to let me be my own banker and deploy resource myself. That's the point. That's the power of this. To summarize this video, as servants of Jesus Christ, we should be the banker for our whole lives or until Christ returns, whichever comes first. We should seek to deploy our resources to invest in the people around us, our own community, ourselves. The least we could do is deposit money with the bankers for interest. And high cash value, dividend-paying whole life insurance contracts from well-run mutual companies have all the right features, all the right ingredients for me to do this, for me to be my own banker. I'm not saying that Jesus is telling us to buy a specific product. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm simply demonstrating that mutually owned whole life insurance, correctly structured, has all the right features to live according to the financial principles that Jesus taught. There are places in the world that do not have whole life. Matter of fact, most places in the world don't have whole life insurance. It's still a good idea to control the banking function on a you and me level for an individual specific needs. But here in North America and other places where whole life is available, it provides the absolute best way to do this, the most profitable way to do this. So, if you haven't already looked into it, I highly encourage you to look into this concept, infinite banking concept. Start with Nelson Nash and his books. So this concludes part 4. In the next video is part 5, which is our last video of the series, and we're gonna look at the financial principle. We're gonna look at what it really means to be a banker, and it comes from Matthew 25. This principle to invest or lend according to your own abilities. So that just really understanding what a banker is. So what we're going to look at, we're going to not only look at this teaching from Jesus, this parable from Jesus, we're also going to look at some other examples throughout Scripture where this principle applies and where it can be helpful to understand our own abilities. But then we're going to look at an example of what are our abilities, what are maybe some expenses, how are banks and other financial institutions profiting from our behavior, our financial behavior. And at that point, once you realize what's happening, what's going on, then it's as simple as implementing a simple strategy, a simple system to divert that cash flow and capture it for yourself, to really maximize and substantially improve the stewardship over the blessings God has given us. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.